Rome, if you were to
Okay,
summarize
you're
our conversation today in like a sentence, what would be the sentence? I'll give you, you can use a couple sentences. We'll just say,
yeah,
if you
yeah, yeah.
tweet.
Um, where I come from is a perspective that anything you're doing, marketing, retention, whatever, you always should be coming back to the value you're providing to your customer. Fundamentally, like that is why a company exists, is to provide value to your customers. I think it's like a very like business school exercise. You get those charts of customers' perceived value, what you charge, what your costs are. As much of as much as that is trite, it's really the truth. And so I think it's important, as you're working on anything as a marketer, as a data person, you're thinking about the levers that you're pulling, recognizing how they play into that broader equation and making sure that whatever you're doing is driving towards that value to the customer so that the company can extract their piece of that value.
Oh, I forget what we say here.
So you just said you can introduce yourself and I'll introduce myself. So we'll do it again.
All right. Hey everyone, Sean Collins.
I'm Ibi Syed, and this is Numbers and Narratives. Today we've got Rome Arnold in. Rome, do you want to give a quick intro on what you do, and then we'll get the show started?
Thanks for having me on. I'm Rome. I'm the founder of a stealth company building software in the elder care space. I come from sort of a technical and data background, and Ibby, we met when I had sort of found my way into the world of marketing, working at Because Market, which is a e-commerce brand for older adults, where I was leading retention and marketing data.
Yeah, this was a super, super fun episode. Rome, thank you so, so much for coming on. Yeah, everyone enjoy. I kind of want to start off on something interesting. You mentioned in the show notes that lots of companies don't think about long-term LTV. They're usually focused on, they're focused on singular metrics, bringing things down. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Like fundamentally, I think retention is comes down to just like delivering value to your customers, and everything else is like on the margins, is on the gimmicks, and like that's the way we for a while kind of had retention living as a customer service or living within the customer service org. So the people who were responsible analyzing that data, doing experiments, whatever, it was very much a customer service focus. And then marketing was a separate organization. And so you had a little bit of, I wouldn't call it an issue, but like you just ended up having a disconnect between the two. And so often what that would lead to is sort of conversations of like, hey, CAC's looking really good, great. A couple weeks later, wow, retention really took a hit, or retention's looking great, whatever. And so when I was at the company, I ended up taking on retention, but sitting that under a marketing function. And so that became like a big project for me, was trying to give us a better picture of the relationship between those things. And in particular, looking at, we saw like really strong correlation between where we acquired customers and what that retention ended up looking like. And then of course there was also CAC trade-offs between those. And so I spent time like building models where we could look at, based on, in a given week, based on where we were acquiring customers, what would we project just based on that channel mix that our retention will land. And the benefit there is because inherently CAC is something you can measure pretty much in the moment, but retention, which feeds into your lifetime value for the customer, there's just a lag towards getting to that. I think there are certainly things, and especially like tech companies, when you have a lot of data coming in from customers, they're often like early leading indicators that can let you read retention sooner. I know it's a common topic would be, what is the retention this customer going to be based on like use in the first 5 days of a tech product. With an e-commerce company, you just don't have that kind of data. And so that's where we end up having just a longer lag on being able to actually read what's happening. So that became a big project for us, was like connecting those two things together and understanding that trade-off, so that then when we were looking at CAC on a week-to-week basis, which is something that, it's a lever you have really strong control over, making sure that we weren't pushing projects that would end up having like a long-term detriment to LTV. I think the other component is also understanding the times when potentially a drop in CAC can be stronger than the drop in retention. I think that's something that was initially hard to stomach, but with the right understanding of those trade-offs and the right modeling, you could see it work. So you could run a campaign, let's say you cut your CAC 60%, your LTV or your first month retention ends up falling 40%. These are fake numbers and probably the math won't check out. But what you could have happen is a situation where your first month retention has fallen significantly. And so your total cohort retention looks really bad. But the behavior of those customers ends up being stronger in the long tail. And so this is something that we saw in some cases is you could have that initial fall off be really dramatic. So from a sort of weekly metrics view, alarm bells are going off. This retention has dropped like crazy. But when you balance that against how cheap the customers were to acquire, it actually ends up being positive on an LTV to CAC ratio perspective. And so that's where I think in general, just having a strong feedback loop between retention and CAC is really helpful to make sure that you're optimizing for the right net efficiency for the business. Because at the end of the day, that's the part that matters. You can reduce your CAC incredibly low, but if none of those customers retain, it doesn't matter. You're still wasting money.
Yeah, I mean, I think how do I say this? I mean, it's like you talk to marketers, and I think there's marketers who come from a couple camps, right? There's people who are ruthlessly focused on CAC. There's people who constantly think about LTV, and there's people that think about what that ratio is. And I think that third is the smallest bucket. I think more people are just picking one of the numbers, and they're not thinking about what that means kind of holistically. And so, I think one of the things that's really interesting about that, though, is it really does depend on your product, I think, a lot, right? Like, A, what is the buying cycle? B, what is the baseline retention rate that you have, or repeat? Like, I actually get kind of frustrated about retention for most non-subscription products. I would prefer to call it like repeat purchase rate. I guess, or are there channels you have found that were consistently lower LTV or higher LTV, and then same question for CAC, and then same question for that ratio? Like, are there channels that you found drove that, or was it tactics, or kind of what helped you figure out what optimal was?
Yeah, I think part of the point you made on the camps of optimizing CAC, optimizing LTV versus the trade-off between the two, the way I think about it is effectively we're doing like multivariable linear calculus. And to a certain extent, you can't always be keeping track of everything and optimizing everything. What I think tends to be commonplace is to take the helpful assumption that, okay, I'm going to optimize this campaign. We're going to reduce our CAC by some percent, and we're going to assume that the customers we're acquiring are all going to be of the same quality despite these optimizations. As such, the LTV will be flat. The flip side being, okay, customers are coming in, we're going to work on the retention to improve our LTV, but it's not going to have an impact on the customers coming in. I think there are a lot of times where that can be a safe assumption to make. If you're not making huge sweeping changes, if we're talking about optimizations, maybe, adjusting your CAC on the order of 5 to 10%, probably the changes you're making may not be driving that change in the group on the retention side. What I'm thinking a lot about is when you're really making dramatic changes, you're completely changing the way you're acquiring customers. Let's say you've completely revamped your acquisition flow, or you're trying an entirely new channel. That's where it becomes really important to pay attention to the trade-off between the two, because you really just can't continue to make the assumption that, okay, because we've acquired these customers here, they're going to continue to behave in the same way. The analogy that I've talked about before that I like to give, so with our adult diaper business, we could go out, let's say someone's cousin runs a series of child daycare centers, and so we get free product placement and free advertising placement. We get a pamphlet handed to every parent. That could be really, really cheap acquisition cost, let's say just effectively free. But fundamentally, none of those parents need adult diapers, they need child diapers. And so if they end up with the wrong product, none of them are going to retain. And so that's also where the lag can be a problem, where when you have initially run that campaign, all of a sudden you've acquired thousands of customers at no cost. Your CAC is going to drop. Everything looks fantastic. It's, champagne around the office. Then once that data comes in, not a single one of those customers actually converts to a full-time or to a retaining customer. Then, you end up with that trade-off. So that's where I think it's important. At some point, you can't always be watching every variable, and you need to, in order to solve the equation, you kind of need to hold some things constant. But it's important when you're making those bigger changes to recognize when it might actually change fundamentally who is the customer that's coming in the door, and are their behaviors going to be different.
I appreciate that you didn't use too much calculus terminology there. I walked out of calc I sat down, the teacher started speaking, and I just got up and walked out and never went back. So you almost lost me, but I think I got that. And I think so. I want to keep kind of pulling that thread for a second. When I was agency side, Facebook had just kind of launched lead campaigns. And I remember getting so jacked up that I was getting leads to sign up for my client's list at like $1 a lead. And I was just touting this on every slide of like, I just built your list, like thousands of people, the cheapest thing you've ever seen. And there was enough lag between like, oh, well, we'd expect it to be, 30 days. And then we just wouldn't, didn't do a good enough job optimizing those cohorts. Or, so we'd say, oh, let's run some more tests on how to activate these people. And so I think it's interesting when you talk about, because we knew Facebook was a tried and true channel for us on other campaign formats. So it's not even just like new channels, right? It's like any new tactic, any new message, any new hook, any new whatever can truly throw off the quality of either customer or lead that you're getting.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Rome, I've got a question for you. And the answer could just be no, the relationship does not exist. But when you're trying to do should I say, the political side of this, in my experience, when you see CAC go down, it's an objective metric, right? You can basically point to one thing and say, hey, this is the lever that we pulled, and this is the metric that came down. Versus LTV, as you said before, is a lagging indicator where, especially if you've got your growth/acquisition and your retention teams in separate silos, it's a little bit hard to sort of have that interplay between the two of them. How do you think about, as a data person, making that case? Like, how did you make that case when that happened, right? Like, who did you go to? Did you find any issues? I mean, your team is really, really smart, but historically, have you seen any issues, explaining to people, hey, like, I know we've gotten cheap. In this case, it actually seems to have worked out for you, but in the case that it doesn't, how do you think about actually explaining to people that it's not necessarily worth it to drive that CAC down? And going back to what you said as well, Sean, I assume that it's sort of a similar case.
Yeah, I think some of it comes down to just having a strong sense, and this is something we worked on, was like when you're running an experiment, recognizing that, right, the experiment is not just going to be your conversion rate, it's not just going to be what your acquisition looks like, but actually taking the time to watch those cohorts. I think one of the things that we had done from a data perspective was built quite a lot of just like Excel-based models where we would use historical data of varying degrees of freshness to give us sort of range of confidence, projecting out what that LTV would look like, what those repeat purchase rates would look like. And so what we would do is, when running an experiment, particularly if we see a really dramatic change in the customer acquisition cost, we would do some calculations to understand kind of like what is our range of comfort where this is worth continuing. What do we need to see from that first month, a repeat purchase? Where does this cohort need to be landing for us to say, okay, this is something that can keep going. And then importantly, continuing to watch that step by step. So, we were a subscription-based business. It was monthly. So we had pretty strong regularity into that. That's not always a benefit that a business will have. So in some ways, we're also looking at like retention through inaction, right? Retention through folks not churning. But so that was just a big component of it. Was I had a number of models that the team could use where we would be, sort of calculating that LTV to CAC ratio. So, okay, our CAC has come way down, even when it was a good thing, even when we thought this is a great opportunity for us, we would then take a look at the retention side and say, okay, what is the sort of bounds of acceptable that will make this experiment work? And then as we start to get early data, we could look at what that trade-off is. Because again, I think a lot of the success I had sort of from the political side, to your point, I was accountable to the retention metrics, and I think it was not effective to have it be sort of a lagging loop to say retention dropped this week. Now I'm going to go tell you why. It's actually because we acquired way more customers through this channel who are weaker in these reasons, and like our CAC was correspondingly low. So the benefit is okay. One of the things I did was built a model that we talked about before, looking at that mix of customers. So how many customers came in through Facebook, how many customers came in through offline channels, how many customers came in through affiliate programs. I would use that to give a blended projection every week. And so as that CAC number came in, I would have a report on what are we projecting the retention for this group is going to be. So that way, kind of as those numbers bounced around, we had that ratio in mind. And an important component of that was then 4 weeks later, when that number actually came in, I would compare actuals versus projection, partially as a way of showing like how are we performing on the other side of retention, right? We're talking a lot about retention from a marketing perspective, which is all about how do you find the right customers? How do you find the customers who inherently want your product? Then there's the other side of like the customers you've already found. How do you help them find more value from your product? So that lag and that comparison between actual and projection helped us understand, are we growing within that group? And then also with experiments would help you say, okay, this experiment that we ran, even though the CAC was good, it's outside of our bounds of acceptable. We need to stop. Or it's actually, better than what would be a comparative performance if it were, XYZ other value. But I will say that I think in general, it's hard. The math here is complicated. We're not talking about linear relationships. It's not that simple. And that's why I think it can be really hard for teams to wrap their heads around like how these things are changing, despite, I had 4 or 5 different tools that we're using to model all these different components and understand the trade-offs, but it is still, it's hard.
I do want to spend, a bunch of time talking about the value side of it, but before we kind of pivot that way, you mentioned something that might confuse and or scare a bunch of people, where you said, as you're running these tests, you can't just look at the immediate impact, the immediate value of, hey, we set our conversion metric as this for this test, and we have a 95% confidence rating that that's the better treatment. You have to look at the long tail and kind of look at what the long-term effects are. For all the people who've been told that you should always be testing, you should be moving fast, you got to get to that stat sig and then ship it and move on to the next thing. How long do they now have to wait, and how much slower do they have to go? And does that mean like run an experiment, stop and go back to 100% on the control, evaluate the results for a quarter? Or like what are we actually talking about here, and how do you do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's 2 pieces to it. I do think the patience is challenging. I think that's where we mentioned, you may want to look for earlier indicators depending on the test. I think there's also an element where it's not necessarily to say that you can't move forward, but it's understanding it becomes less of a question of certainty and more a question of conviction, which is something now as a founder I've been thinking a lot about. Is those 2 things do not go together. So that's where I think that like modeling, understanding the range between, okay, what's the lower bound, what's the upper bound? If this experiment came through, where would it need to be? So let's say, back to the examples I used before, like let's say you were at $150 CAC, you drop it to a $50 CAC. Take the time at that point to then say, like, how far would retention have to fall to make this not worth it to continue? And look at that number, and just that's where it's sort of art as much as science to say, do I believe that? Like, do I really think if I looked at this group of customers, is that how poor our performance is going to be? And frankly, I think there are also tactics you could use. I mean, truly like survey style, go call 10 of those customers. And if you need to hit a minimum 20% repeat purchase rate, pick 10 customers, call them and ask them how it's going. And, if you can get 4 or 5 people who seem positive on the product, I think that can be enough of an indication. So it's not to say that you can't make a decision or you can't move forward, but you need to recognize that there's always going to be a trade-off, and you can't, as when you see those really dramatic moves, you can't make the assumption that nothing else has changed. So that's where I think, like, to look at it from the lens of a marketer, I would also ask yourself, to take a step back, the way I think about retention fundamentally is, it's not about gimmicks. It's not about rewards programs and points and whatever. Fundamentally, you retain customers because you give them value. And so anytime you're running a marketing experiment, you're thinking about what that customer acquisition flow looks like. The question I would just ask myself is, okay, I've seen this great performance. Do I think I'm really finding our best customers? Like, do I think I'm finding the best people? It goes back to the analogy before about, the daycare centers, but you can think about it in the same way from a channel perspective, right? Let's say like you're trying out a new affiliate channel and you see really good performance. Take a minute to think about, like, what is this affiliate channel? I think this is a common thing. You could be using, for instance, like a Super Saver coupon site. So let's say you've done that, you get really good customer acquisition costs, but then you look at your brand and you say, well, we're a, premium eco-sustainable alternative to whatever. Like, this is a premium product. Odds are the folks that you're getting from the Super Coupon Clipper site are probably not the strongest match to your target audience. And so it's not to say that that's a bad choice, right? Like, you might be finding people who just love deal hunting but still want premium products. Fantastic. But you should expect that among that whole cohort, you're going to see a fall. And so I think it's just taking that extra step to not just look at what did it cost me to acquire a customer, but think about who that customer is and what among that cohort, like, what does that represent in terms of fit to your brand's ideal customer?
So you're saying that not every customer is the same?
Exactly.
Interesting.
And I think, I mean, this is where I again, I'm not a marketer. I'm a data guy who does marketing. And so I definitely have hot takes and wrong opinions, but I hold them strongly. I'm a big believer that marketing is not about convincing your customer, convincing someone to buy from you. Marketing is about finding someone who wants to buy your product and putting it in front of them. And so that's where I think about this sort of thing is, yes, there are going to be people on the fringes, people who like to try things. I mean, I think this is something we've seen, on Facebook in particular, from a channel perspective, is like there are certain people who just like love to click on every single ad they see. They're just very curious. They're exploring whatever. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're looking for your product. And so that's where, you could see, like, you could have a really clickbaity ad and get a really great CPC. But again, it comes back to that question of, are you out there finding the customers who need your brand? Because that's really, at the end of the day, the objective.
Or if you're an app and they're just clicking, they're probably on an Android and they're not actually people clicking. No, that is a great point though.
Those are all like, I don't know if you go look at the doc that we have on the side, I've just like written down so many of your quotes. Those are really, really good. I really like, I just in general really like the honesty and that sort of approach, because I think it'll probably frustrate lots of companies, especially in this age of, I'm going to take a generic product, slap like a pretty brand on it, and sell it online or something. I think that's fundamentally why you start to see products like that get initially great traction, because it's like, oh, this is cool and fun, but then 1.5 million competitors show up and it's fundamentally just not a very good product or a very differentiated product. And I think like thinking about it from that lens where it's like, hey, I've created something that people do want, and I have this strong conviction that people do want it. Let me try to find out where those people live and actually put it in front of them and see how it replicates to those. Kind of a follow-up question for you, Rome. Going back to the CAC question that we had, subscription brands in general can kind of afford a slightly higher CAC, but then what you do is you see this like setting and forgetting element of it where they've decided, hey, they want to buy your product, it is a good fit, and they don't necessarily like need to be upsold. How do you think about talking to them and then doing that post-purchase marketing within your existing customer base and getting them to like expand their cart and repeatedly buy more than one product over and over again? Does that make sense?
Yes, no, I'm also just thinking because I have separate hot takes about subscription e-commerce. I want to kind of touch on actually one of the points that you made, not answering your question, but the assumption that like subscription brands can afford a higher CAC. To a certain extent, I don't personally believe that that's necessarily the right way to think about it, as much as it is that subscription brands will drive a higher CAC. This is definitely like an extreme hot take, having worked in a subscription business previously, but back to the point that fundamentally customer retention comes down to driving value for your customers. Take a step back and think about to an extent. A lot of the time when it comes to a subscription, particularly from a customer acquisition perspective, if I don't know if I like your product yet, if I don't know if it's useful to me, putting me on a subscription is not actually like an excellent experience. Making me have to remember to opt out and to, not purchase the thing again is not really an excellent experience. And so I think that's why you often see with brands, we offer a discount for a subscription. What we're trying to do is sort of introduce more friction and force you to come back and think about it. But fundamentally, if the product has not solved your problem, you're gonna cancel. Now, maybe the brand might get one extra purchase out of you because you're on the fence, you're lukewarm. I think that's where there's some value. But at the same time, what you're doing is pushing off all those people who are on the fence before making that first purchase and don't kind of want to deal with it. Those folks are not becoming a customer in the first place. And I think it's hard to get the balance here. This is something where I had run some experiments around this, looking at giving people the optionality and letting people kind of opt into a subscription instead of opting out of it. And you do end up seeing like there's very much a trade-off between the two. It was not sort of this like magical unlock of new customers, but to a certain extent, where my really hot take comes from is the value to. Let me put it differently. I think subscriptions in e-commerce got really hot because, frankly, investors saw how valuable repeat purchases were in the tech world and thought, how do we apply this to other products? The distinction is back to the question of what is the value you're providing your customer. When you think about a Spotify subscription, the value I get as a customer is I'm paying one price and I have infinite usage. I could put Spotify on repeat on 4 devices literally for the entire month. Every second of the day there's music playing and I'm still paying one price. So you've given me as a customer this sort of infinite upside, and my cost is that I'm having to pay you this flat rate. And so if I don't use it, if I end up not listening to any music that month, I'm still paying you. That fundamentally does not apply. That sort of like infinite margin that you're providing the customer doesn't apply in e-commerce. If I'm on a subscription that is a set number of products, you have not created a scenario where I can now get, I can't get more value out of my razors. My razors don't have infinite use because I'm on a subscription. I just get a recurring purchase. And so I think it's just important to come back to the question of what you're doing with a subscription and a customer is effectively like you're locking yourselves into a little bit of a contract, and there's a trade of value happening there. You're giving the customer a discount in exchange for them, having to deal with a little bit of extra friction. I think there can be a case that's made where there is a convenience element. I think for some folks, if it's a product they really love and they know they're going to use it and they use it very regularly, there is that element of automatic purchasing coming in. But I'm not convinced that that is really that big of a deal. I mean, purchasing is so frictionless at this point in the world that like it's really not that necessary. Or it's, you know, there's not so much friction. I mean, you think sort of back to like when Amazon had those refill buttons out in the world, right? I mean, we're talking about like the most frictionless experience possible. So it's hard for me to look at that and say, oh yeah, the subscription is like really providing this like great convenience for someone that they don't have to remember it. I think if it's something you're using all the time, you know when it's running out. So I come back to that. It's not to say that like subscriptions are bad, subscription businesses are evil. I think it's just really important to be honest with yourself about what is it that you're doing, right? And it's really about changing that paradigm of retention, where instead of needing to reach out and remind you and convince you, we can rely on sort of the automatic relationship, and then, you know, the steps that need to happen are churn instead of a repeat purchase. So I know you asked originally a question about
Get that.
driving more,
There
but
was so much gold in that it doesn't matter. I mean, it's like the first
There's
thing,
yeah.
like you're right. Like not everything needs to be a subscription. You know, and I agree. There are times some products that do provide a lot more value as a subscription than others, right? Like maybe it's like a meal kit, right? I would say the convenience of not having to think about what you're gonna cook, go to the grocery store, cart it all home, especially, you know, you live somewhere in New York, like carrying boxes around sucks. You know, you giving me the recipes, you making it easy and having some of it like pre-chopped, or like there's a lot of convenience there. But at the same time, and you know, you're right, like you'll know you're running low on food, but then you still have to find time to go to the grocery and come up with all the plan and coordinate with whoever on whatever. You know, the flip side, there's also dark patterns, right? Like you're saying, do you remind people that they have an order coming up so that they have a chance to cancel their subscription, or do you wait until it processes and say, by the way, your new subscription shipping? I had a funny one I like to make fun of Ibby for. He sent me a gift card for a box of wine as a part of another bigger gift he gave me. It was like he didn't even know that he gave that this is part of the gift, but it was in the package. So I ordered this wine thinking I'm getting a gift. They sent me a follow-up. Apparently I signed up for a subscription without even trying to. So suddenly I get a thing while I'm out of town that like, hey, your delivery didn't make it because you weren't here to sign for this thing, but we've already charged you. It's already there. It's like, okay, well, like I thought I was getting a gift of wine and now I have a subscription, and they're, you know, it's crazy. So there's dark patterns you can go into there. There's consumer dark patterns, right? Where like I know I'm gonna buy this once, but you're giving me 20% off to subscribe and save. So I'm gonna subscribe, get my 20%, and I'm gonna cancel right away. Like that's equally, you know, jacked up. You know, it is really interesting when you think about like what is the value, what are the products that deserve or maybe like make sense as a subscription. And if you want to try and make a subscription work, I think there's unique ways you can package it up and contribute value that's more than just, hey, now you don't have to go to the store and think about it, or now you don't have to remember to check the cabinet every month to see if you need toilet paper today or if you're good for a couple weeks or anything like that. I do think there's also those usage patterns, right? Like maybe you know, you mentioned razors. Maybe you shaved less this week because you decide you're going to grow a beard or whatever. And so you just now you have like I have from Dollar Shave Club, I think I have like 8 things of razors just like piled up in my cabinet because I keep not wanting to cancel that or just being distracted to. So it is interesting, and it does create a whole different set of problems that you have to solve for, again, if your focus is on value for the customer and not just increasing revenue, right?
I think it's exactly that point, coming back to the value to the customer and just making sure that when you're thinking about adding a subscription or you're already on a subscription business, I just think you can never, you will always win in the long term. I shouldn't say you'll always win, but you'll certainly lose in the long term if you're not thinking about the value you give to your customer. If you're prioritizing the value of your business, if you're thinking about a subscription because, oh wow, we can like guarantee this amount of revenue, or we can project what the revenue, you know, we'll have more predictability. If that's the mentality you're coming from, I think you should take a step back and you're headed down a dangerous path. I mean, take your wine example. That is a thing I thought about quite a lot. Is someone signs up for a subscription, we can assume you can add all the bells and whistles you want to make sure someone's aware of it. I think people a lot of the time just, you might have enjoyed that wine delivery service, and given a little bit more time, you could have become a subscriber. You could have decided that you really like it. But that subscription has ended up creating an incredibly negative experience for you. And so not only are you now canceling your subscription, you're probably disputing it with your credit card company. You're fighting on the phone with their customer service agents to get it solved. So you're not only have you had a poor experience, but you've actually cost the company money, right? Because now they're not getting revenue that maybe they hold on to it, but that's still just the hassle, the pain. And then the flip side, of course, is going to be that now you're potentially someone where, you're going to be a negative referral for that brand. Other people are going to talk about it, and you say, oh, I had this horrible experience. That becomes sort of a dinner party story for you about how frustrated you were. So
I mean, if Sean had mentioned the wine company name, that is a negative referral on a podcast for that company. A podcast
Exactly.
that has like 0 listeners as of current, because we have
Millions of listeners.
millions of listeners because we haven't launched one yet. But
Yeah, so I think I just think it's important. I mean, like everything else, I guess, the title of this podcast can just be like everything in moderation, but a subscription is itself another tool, and you need to know how you're using it, and you need to be intentional about how you're using it. And assuming that, well, investors give more money to subscription companies, that might be true, but I also among my hot takes as a founder, I don't think that investors know what's best for companies. And so, take that with a grain of salt. But, a subscription can be a valuable tool. But again, think about what is the value that you're delivering to your customers with that subscription, and make sure that then the patterns that you build into it are aligned with that. So I think it could be fantastic that you offer a subscription, and customers who've been with you 3 months, they really like the product, they figured out their assortment. Maybe a subscription is fantastic for them, and you can layer things into that subscription that really cater to that long-term customer. Trying to force every customer into a subscription from day one can end up being painful.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. I think I would like to continue talking about how to optimize and like how to think about when and how to have a subscription business versus just get good LTV through customer service, a good product, and then like building a brand. I think we'd actually planned on talking a lot about customer service, and we didn't even get to that part yet. I think we do have to wrap up, so we'll probably have to do that on a second one. Hey, Rome, this was absolutely great. I had a fantastic time hearing your hot takes on CAC, on LTV, on retention, on subscriptions. We are out of time. Anything you want to leave the listeners with?
I'm overthinking it now, so
That could also be the title of this episode.
Actually, that's going to be my epitaph. I incorporated my company on January 4th because I was going to do it on January 2nd, and I overthought it for a little bit. Yeah, I don't know that I have anything that much pithier. But yeah, thanks for having me on.